Good afternoon, dear colleagues. I'd like to thank the museum for the invitation to such a great conference, and I apologize to my foreign colleagues. I do not have the translation into English to some of the notes on the slides in Russian. So in February of 1919, Petrograd held the All-Russian Museum Conference about the plans of museum construction in the Soviet Union. The nationalized collections were supposed to be regarded as a uniform museum fund. New museums emerged and then disappeared. Bigger museums were divided with their collections sent to the smaller ones, and these changes didn't always benefit the museums. They were mostly painful for the biggest collections of the Hermitage and unique ones like Shchukin and Morozov's collections. As the director of the Hermitage, Sergei wrote, who was later the head of the decorative art in the Pushkin Museum, I quote, "Museums are living organisms, and a forced exchange of exhibits between the museums is as painful and dangerous as a blood transfusion from one person to another." End quote. The whole idea of the exchange of pieces from the collection emerged way earlier, in August of 1917, when the Germans were approaching Petrograd. The Hermitage collection was to be evacuated to Moscow, and Moscow, Igor Grabar and Fross came from Moscow, and they suggested opening a Hermitage exhibition in Moscow. The exhibition never happened because the curators and the director of the Hermitage were against it. They didn't want to unpack and then repack the paintings. They were afraid it would cause them harm. Dmitry Tolstoy remembered, I quote, "There was another thing that scared me, that the paintings once unpacked and exhibited in Moscow could not go back." End quote. After the Kremlin was taken by the Red Army, most boxes containing Petrograd paintings were kept in the Kremlin before. Now they had to be transferred to other locations. And as many of them were piled on top of one another, the museum department of the Narkompros often questioned whether they should be unpacked and an exhibition should be established in Moscow. Maybe part of the collection should be kept in Moscow forever. Anatoly Lunacharsky, who was the Commissar of Enlightenment, said that the commissary didn't mind the return of the collection to Petrograd, but at the same time was wondering about the more even distribution of the artistic treasures between the two capitals. They wanted to distribute the Moscow collections of Shchukin and Morozov, but Moscow painters wanted that some Petrograd works should be reserved for Moscow instead, for a more even dissemination of artistic treasures between the capitals. But in November, the people of Petrograd asked for it, and Lenin decided that the collections of Petrograd Museum were returned from Moscow, so they didn't remain in Moscow. And in the during the first museum conference, a Moscow declaration was agreed upon and compiled by Muratov and Grabar. 3 art museums were to be established in Moscow: Western art, Oriental art, Art and the National Art Museum. So the creation of the Museum of Western Art was started, and the collection was to be redistributed between the Hermitage and the new museum. In November 1922, a commission was formed in order to choose paintings to Moscow from the Petrograd museums. This commission noted that the population of the capital should be served by a significant number of first-rate pieces that were to be moved from Petrograd to Moscow. A group from Moscow with Grabar, Efros, Mashkovtsev, Trapeznikov and Romanov came to Petrograd, and they were on a mission, as Benoit wrote it, to create a great museum of Western art in Moscow, which was to contain the masterpieces from Petrograd museums, Rubens, Rembrandt and Raphael. So some pieces from the Hermitage collection were to be assigned, as well as from the collections of Stroganovs, Yusupovs, Shuvalovs and Sheremetyevs. At the same time, Alexander Benoit, who was developing the plan of reorganizing the Hermitage gallery, put forth a question of giving some paintings of the late 19th, early 20th century from Moscow collections to the Hermitage, so that at least a small department of the new paintings could exist there, which would logically continue the Kushelev gallery that was given to the Hermitage by the Academy of Arts.
The director of Fine Art Museum, Nikolai Romanov, wrote that the commission from Moscow and St. Petersburg went through the Hermitage's stock, and the idea was that the future Museum of Old Western Painting in Moscow should represent all the main directions in Western painting, and together with Benoit they found the first-rate works from the Hermitage. However, they noted that the Hermitage's interest as a world-class collection should be put first. However, the Hermitage representatives were able to find some of their best paintings that they could give over to Moscow without any detriment to the collection. And in 1923, the decision on exchange between the Hermitage and the Morozov and Shchukin collections in Moscow was taken. In 1924, all the wishes of Moscow and the Hermitage were reflected in the final decision, and the exchange itself took place from 1924 to 27, when the works were transferred. And at the same period, the Hermitage experienced other difficulties because it had to cede quite a lot of works to Poland according to the Treaty of Riga. That meant all the artworks that ended up in Russia from Poland, from Polish collections. Since the end of the 18th century, the division of Poland and the first Polish insurrections. This was very hard because no inventories were present, they needed to find equivalents, and the whole situation was rather fraught with trouble. When it comes to transfers from St. Petersburg to Moscow, they were not noted in Europe, and Adolfo Venturi, a famous sculpture historian and scholar who was quite familiar with the Hermitage collections, he came to St. Petersburg after the Hermitage acquired the Benoit Madonna to verify the attribution of the painting to Leonardo. So he wrote these years, as a person familiar with the Hermitage, that the Hermitage should not be diminished, and nothing could be taken from this organic whole without breaking this organism. it would be the same as tearing a page from a book on art open to the public. In 1927, after one of the transfer, the State Museum, later Pushkin Museum, was quite satisfied and confirmed it. They received 473 paintings and 44 sculptures. However, the transfer of artworks to the Hermitage from the Shchukin and Morozov collections kept being postponed. In 1928, the Hermitage Council raised the question once again. It was talking about the second half of the 19th century French masters, and they mentioned the interest of the audience in St. Petersburg in such painting, especially art students. Even traveling to Moscow was outside of the means of such students, while the Hermitage could not acquire paintings of this age. The Art Life newspaper published a petition to transfer newer French paintings to the Hermitage. However, the scientific directorate suggested that the Hermitage should transfer more of its old masters' pictures in exchange for the Moscow Western Art Museum's paintings. This was especially hard for the Hermitage, as they had already begun picking artworks to be sold abroad by that time. They needed to earn 1,300,000 rubles through those sales for the state. At the same time, the Hermitage had taken over the responsibility of the State Museum Foundation, which meant that it was responsible for bringing artworks to museums across the whole country. The negotiations moved on, and the Hermitage was asked to bring over one sculpture by Rodin, one portrait by Volaton into Moscow, as well as some other works. And at the same time, the Stroganov Palace was finally decided to be sold. In December 1929, James Schmidt, the head of the Hermitage Paintings Department, wrote, the Hermitage needs the late 19th century paintings, but we cannot do this by giving away our great masterpieces by Titian, Raphael or Rembrandt. We cannot build a second world-class museum using the Hermitage paintings, just moving them over to Moscow. It will create two big museums, but none of them will be as good as the previous one, and they will by necessity be fragmented. This emotion is quite understandable, because very recently he had to create a list of the main masterpieces of the Hermitage, about 20 paintings. He had to evaluate them because at that time the contract with Carlos Gulbenkian was already signed, so that some of the best paintings would be sold to this industrialist in exchange for the access for the Soviet Union to the global market of oil. And the annunciation by Dirk Boats had already been sold to Gulbenkian. By 1930, the Hermitage got its last warning to send paintings to the Pushkin Museum in Moscow, and at the same time they had selected almost 20,000 items to be sold abroad. Besides Gulbenkian, Andrew Mellon began purchasing paintings from the Hermitage. He bought 21 paintings for $6.5 million, as well as Rembrandt societies in the Netherlands were buying, and the whole gallery was not sold only because they didn't find enough buyers. The Hermitage tried to protect its collection and addressed to the public, and representatives of all the segments of society were drawn into a special commission, representatives of ministries, of cultural commissions, museums, as well as painters such as Malevich and Lebedev, as well as Kuzma Petrov-Vodkin. This joint committee had several meetings with very lively discussions. We have documents of these discussions. They all agreed that the Hermitage masterpieces should not be given over, but this had no effect. However, thanks to the interference of Malevich, Lebedev and Sukov, together with the Hermitage staff, a list of 45 paintings was finally made that the Hermitage would like to receive from the Moscow Museum of the New and Western Art. The idea must have stemmed from Petrov-Vodkin that these collections should be given over not to the Hermitage, but rather to the Art College, the former Academy of Arts. But this idea was not realized. They wrote that the Hermitage would conserve these paintings better. And in February 1930, these paintings were given over from the Moscow Museum to the Hermitage. It was 43 paintings all in all, 24 of which had belonged to the Shchukin collection. At the same time, in February 1930, the Moscow Fine Arts Museum received 79 paintings from the Hermitage, among which Rinaldo and Armida, as well as the Hercules landscape by Poussin, a painting by Rembrandt, one Cima de Conigliano, the Venus with Mirror by Titian, as well as 869 Old Master drawings, Rubens, Van Dyck, Jordaens, Dürer, Watteau, and so on. Both these sets of artworks were featured in special exhibitions in both museums, and this exhibition was seen as a unique event for Moscow with world-class masterpieces. The exhibition attracted lots of people, but this didn't stop anyone. The Titian Venus, as well as Joseph and Potiphar's Wife by Rembrandt, were sold to Mellon very, very soon. The Hermitage opened a separate department of contemporary French painting, and we see it documented in the guide to the museum from the same year. These paintings from the Shchukin collection were featured in the Hall 57. Currently we have Dutch painters there, if you remember the Hermitage halls. But now the Hermitage deemed this exchange to be unequal, and the director, Boris Legrand, who was one of those appointed directors who were active at the museum at this age when they were selling out the artworks. They were all outside people. He was an old revolutionary. He was the member of the party. He knew Stalin from his youngest years, so his background was from the party and revolution, but he did protect Hermitage with all his might, and he petitioned the scientific directorate to receive more paintings from Moscow, saying that some of the earlier rejections based on the desire to preserve the current exhibition, are not valid anymore because the museum in Moscow has moved. And now the Moscow Western Art Museum director, Ternovets, needed to address the directorate to protect his collections, saying that a new transfer is possible only when the Hermitage gives to the Muscovites the Rodin and the promised paintings. In September of 1930, the Hermitage gave 6 paintings to the Moscow Western Art Museum. Here we see the Segantini painting, and very soon this one was also sold abroad. The considerations for a new list for the Hermitage took place in November. The research commission was deliberating on this list, but the Moscow Museum took its time because they said that they needed to make copies of these paintings. However, next year these paintings were transmitted over to the Hermitage, 35 paintings all in all, 18 out of them from the Shchukin collection. October 31st, 1933, the Hermitage received a letter from the Ministry of Education asking for 18 paintings to be sold abroad. They said that these paintings were mentioned in the Apollo magazine, and very often the foreign buyers selected these paintings using journal and magazine reproductions. These required 1 painting by Renoir, 2 Cézannes and 1 Degas. Boris Legrand said that these are core exhibits of the museum, and removing them means deorganizing the collection. However, we know that the Moscow Fine Arts Museum did sell some of these paintings, and the Hermitage had to part with some of these. But very soon after this very first letter, a new decree came to stop all the sales of museum collections to foreign buyers. These paintings were not sold after all. And in 1934 they came back to the Hermitage and together with them 34 paintings that the Moscow Museum had given over to be sold arrived to St. Petersburg. So there were 34 paintings that were received from the state agency, and 15 of them had belonged to the Shchukin collection before. By the March the 1st of 1931, a new exhibition named, according to the requirements of the time, the imperialistic age, or the rotting capitalism age, was finally completed, and it took halls 413 to 414 in the Hermitage. However, these halls were seen inappropriate from the point of view of lighting, but they had no other free halls, because we must remember that at that time the Winter Palace was still occupied by 2 museums jointly, the Hermitage and the Revolution Museum. This exhibition was discussed at the Methodology Commission, which was created in order to improve the Marxist-Leninist interpretation of the museum collections. Everything had to be treated ideologically, and the public was made part of this ideological commission. Here you see a copy of one of their protocols, where they write Van Gogh instead of Van Gogh and Gauguin instead of Gauguin. And Gauguin must have been really amazed had he learned that subjectively he opposed the industrial bourgeoisie, but objectively he was supporting the colonial policies. Van Gogh was made a proletariat painter, and the Methodological Commission said that Van Gogh was interested in a church-like socialism and not the real needs of the proletariat. We have lots of such papers from the time. And I must say that the Hermitage curator were able to find some compromise between art and ideology, and Valentin Miller, the professor, who studied the new paintings and created this exhibition. Unfortunately, he was killed during the purge of 1937, so he was able in his descriptions of the collection to present not just an ideological but also a purely art historical description of these works, and he used interesting technological innovations for his exhibition. For example, he used flip charts and ways to show the art of different societal classes together. He also used movable stands to show certain parts of the exhibition inside one hall, to compare the art of different social groups without breaking the whole picture. However, in our archive we have some conspects, some materials written by Punin. He wrote lectures for workers' education, and he dealt mainly with art historical questions of figurative and abstract painting and not just class struggle issues. It means that by 1936 the Hermitage received 58 paintings out of the Shchukin collection. That's all from me. Thank you very much. Thank you, Elena. I think it was very interesting in all the presentations in this section, and I think there must be some questions to our speakers. Yes, please. Thank you so much. I've got a question to Irina Karasik. Yes, please do not leave. Irina Karasik, yes, thank you, I see you here. Thank you so much for your presentation. I think it was really interesting. It was a very promising perspective, studying the influence of the new Western art on Russian avant-garde. I really hope that we will be able to see these sketches by Leporskaya in an exhibition. Before I ask my question, I've got a short comment. It's obvious to us all that thanks to Shchukin, Morozov and the new Western Art Museum, Russia got an idea of the new French art that was not always coherent with the French ideas, with the global ideas, and so on. And in Russia, traditionally, Matisse is seen as an equal to Picasso. Outside Russia, it's different. And I'd like to ask you, I think that in choosing the examples for copying that the Malevich student did, there was some kind of hierarchy. They didn't copy Matisse, much like Courtauld did not buy Matisse. There was no Van Gogh, only one painting by Gauguin. How did they choose painters out of the Shchukin collection? How did the Malevich students build their hierarchy? Which painters were the big thing for them, which were outside of the circle?
This question is hard to answer in fullness because we only have fragments of information. We spoke about copying of some pieces, but other copies were never mentioned. There was a copy of Matisse indeed, and Matisse was always mentioned by Malevich, and in the table where the red room was the example of painting in color, of course there were certain biases because the theory of the additional element in all its fullness was, as it was considered to be full, wasn't really complete, but it was most evident at the stage of geometrization of Picasso, which they liked a lot, and on Cubism, so they paid more attention to these artists. Yermolaeva was mainly preoccupied with Derain, and this wasn't a very orthodox characteristics that she gave. I mentioned eclectics. Here I mentioned that they called him as an eclectic artist, not a self-standing one. They discussed whether he had a full artistic view or not. As for Van Gogh, it's hard to say that he was later studied after the Institute period as the prerequisite for Futurism. Many artists were studied, of course, with certain priorities, but we don't have the whole scope of information, unfortunately, at the moment. So this is all also based on the fact that the major systems were Impressionism, Cézannism, Cubism, Futurism, and these are the main systems that Malevich named. There is no Gauguinism or Fauvism. That's it. Thank you. Any more questions? Irina, I also have a question to you. I understood that you showed before in the archives of the Russian State Museum, but the archives of the Institute of Artistic Culture, are they separate? Yes, the archive of the Institute is the central archive of Moscow and St. Petersburg. A lot from Moscow was passed on to higher institutions, and the separate foundation of the State Institute is now being formed in the Lekporskaya archive, but more private documents, notebooks, and notes of communications of Malevich with his students. Then in the 20s, 27, there was no ideology above this, no orientation. Well, it's rather hard to say. Of course, it must have existed, but probably a bit later. The 1928, 1924, 25 were relatively free, but something should have come up. But Malevich could reject these somehow. Okay, thank you. More questions, please? Снова я, прошу прощения. Вопрос к Елене Соломаха. Где вы? Елена, где вы? Елена Соломаха. Нет, похоже, я хочу спрашивать не того человека. Этот вопрос касается ужасающей истории рассеивания государственных коллекций в 30-е годы. Мой вопрос касается рассеивания, продажи такого большого количества шедевров из российских коллекций. Мой первый вопрос. Я не понимаю основополагающие причины, по которым эти работы продавались. И второе, до того, как вы ответите, хочу отметить, что в Австралии, в Мельбурне, самая важная работа старого мастера – это знаменитая Антоний и Клеопатра Тьеполо, которая получена из России. Ребята, спасибо вам огромное. Микрофон плохо работает. The microphone isn't working properly. Unfortunately, it's not audible. Please give the speaker another one. So, first and foremost, I want to say that I don't understand the reason either why our government was selling our artistic collections. Few people understood it back then from the intelligentsia, and many were opposing this. So here, my esteemed colleague Natalia Semenova is here, and together she started working on this. We published a book about the sold treasures of English. It was published, sold treasures of Russia, it was published in English, and we're trying to solve this problem, of course. Tiapolo's piece was sold from Hermitage quite late, but I want to say that at the beginning they tried to sell it to the London National Gallery. Yes, at first this was done through 3 firms which took part in the sales of our masterpieces to Mellon, and this painting was, they wanted just to sell it to anyone who would buy it, and it was so hard to find a buyer because they needed to pay a substantial sum, and this was the Great Depression, prices were low. At first they tried to sell this piece to the London National Gallery, but they didn't like that Tiapolo, and finally they succeeded in selling it to Melbourne, and it's now there.